Hey, School Transportation Nation, it's Tony Corcoran. We're excited you're here for the podcast. It's brought to you by TransFinder, the leader in school bus routing software, and by School Radio, your source for reliable radio communications. With me is Mr. Ryan Gray, editorial extraordinaire. Ryan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Tony. As always, it's a pleasure to be here with the nation.
Awesome. Well, we got the February issue is out now. Guys, go check that out, stnonline.com. The magazine tab, it's also down that right side of the website. You can click on the giant cover, check out the latest and greatest. We got the safety issue. You shall not pass. Big headline there. Obviously, a lot going on with NHTSA, illegal passing, lots of stuff talking about safety things going on. We'll dive a little deeper into that in just a second. I want to bring you up to speed. Ryan's going to be talking with Noelle Ellerson Ng, the Associate Executive Director of Advocacy and Governance at AASA. Basically, that's the School Superintendents Association. We always work with them to identify the Superintendent of the Year. We highlight that and promote it. So it'll be March 6th through the 8th out in New Orleans. We'll be providing coverage of that event and the award ceremony. So we will keep you guys posted. We're going to dive into the headlines. We've got a quick message. Hey, safety is a number one priority for everyone in school transportation, and even more so when needing to communicate in a school bus setting. School radios push-to-talk over cellular or POC radios are the safety enhancement you need to provide clear communication across all aspects of your fleet. Schools, SROs, that's school resource officers, and beyond. School radio helps take safety and connectivity a step further by offering interoperability solutions that bridge conventional two-way radios with POC systems, creating a unified network that boosts effectiveness and safety. This integrated strategy guarantees smooth communication in both emergency situations and daily activities. To learn more about how school radio can improve safety in your communication methods, visit school-radio.com. That's school-radio.com. All right, we're back. Ryan, it has been a roller coaster, man. The name of my article in the February issue is Buckle Up for 2025. And goodness, it has been a buckle up time. The tariffs, President Donald Trump has been very busy. I know gave the industry quite a rattle with threatening tariffs in Canada and Mexico, which definitely will affect the market. He did walk that back, at least for 30 days. Maybe at the time of this, it'll be 21 days left of that 30 days, which it's going to come quick to kind of enhance the border policies and immigration and such. But, you know, what's it really mean for school transportation, right? We have our friends in the north, Microbird, the Girardins, which make a great Type A vehicle. They're in a joint venture with Bluebird, but that's made up in Quebec in an area called Drummondville, which we've both been there. And great facility, great product. And Microbird, and I guess all its wisdom, is going to be opening up a factory in New York. Yeah, they took over another facility. So maybe they saw the writing on the wall and thought, hey, this is a good opportunity to expand manufacturing into the United States. And couldn't have come at a better time, especially if President Trump is positioning for tariffs. Now, it may not be 25%, but it may be something. And that will affect the cost of the bus. It'll affect components. It will affect a lot of things having to do with automotive industry related things. So we'll see what the trickle-down effect to customers is, Ryan. It's still kind of unknown, but we can kind of see the writing coming that there's going to be increased costs.
Absolutely. So what we're really talking about is the supply chain. So many components come from other countries, whether it be Canada, Mexico. So it's not necessarily just talking about where the vehicles are being manufactured. We're coming out of this pretty bad supply chain cycle, Tony, from when we're coming out of COVID-19. I feel over the last year or so, it's really normalized. I think folks, to your point, have been thrown for a loop here. I think there's a lot of concern. And I talked to a lot of folks, and they said, "Hey, this is a negotiation tactic by President Trump," and certainly that's at play. And we saw that last week with both Mexico and then Canada. Now, It's important to note that a 10% tariff with China is in effect. It went into effect last Tuesday. But we've been down that road before, right? So in President Trump's first term, we had that tariff with China. So certainly this is nothing new, but again, it's going to impact things. So many components, especially when you're talking about electric school buses, but even then, the other school buses, the other fuels, whether it be diesel, gasoline, or propane, not necessarily propane anymore, anyways, since Roush Cleantech, really owns that market with Bluebird. But still, there's so many components here there, that come from China or these other countries, and President Trump's talked about tariffs with other countries as well, with Europe. So certainly, it's. I think the manufacturers have been considering this all along. Now, I hearken back to last summer at STN Expo West in Reno, Tony, when we had that OEM panel, and we were talking about, which route is school bus going to go down? If at the time Vice President Kamala Harris wins, what will happen? Obviously, a big champion of electric school bus. And the $5 billion 5-year EPA Clean School Bus program. But then what happens if President Trump returns to the Oval Office, drill baby drill, and everybody was, it's hard a lot of times to get the OEMs to publicly come down on one position or the other, but it was just too early. But there were a lot of questions. It was a very heavily attended session, lots of questions from the attendees. Well, as you can guess, Tony, I've already gone back to that core group and asked them, hey, let's do a reprise this coming July in Reno. And they've all, so far have signed on. I've talked with Bluebird, IC, Cummins, and Thomas, and they've all said that their leadership will support that. So that will be happening in Reno. So something to look forward to. Certainly, again, a lot to talk about. We'll know more on what the tariff landscape looks like, certainly by then. But we've had so many other things at play too, Tony. The California Air Resources Board, before Trump even took office, said that they were going to stop with further waivers on their advanced clean fleet rule, which drives the decisions in about a dozen other states. Michigan being one of them, Oregon, Washington, and others. We've been talking so much about the fuel mix in the marketplace. And I mentioned propane earlier. There's only one game in town right now. Part of the conversation that we had in Reno last year was, is there a world where diesel regains a footing? Because so much with the EPA regulations, with the CARB regulations, have really been designed to phase out diesel eventually, really go more toward the zero emissions. Certainly, the low emissions fuels like a propane certainly have a market. But as we saw last year, Cummins decided not to pursue a propane engine with its fuel agnostic engine that is coming out, and instead sticking with octane or gasoline. And so now have things changed? We're reading a lot of headlines, talking to a lot of folks that diesel now is coming back to play, because if CARB is not going to fully enforce or get the waivers to fully implement advanced clean fleets, then certainly that opens up for the trucking world a lot more diesel in these states that knew that they were going to be limited or diesel would be banned outright in those states. So now that trickles down to school bus, obviously. And it's important to note that advanced clean fleet rules does not cover school buses. That's a separate program under CARB, at least in terms of here in California. But again, that has ripple effects because trucking and trucks, are so closely tied. They're relatives of school buses. So what happens in the trucking world, economies of scale, it will trickle down, and that's what we're going to see in school buses. So a lot at play right now, and that's not even talking about the stuff going on with the Department of Education. President Trump is talking about and has been for years talking about dismantling the Department of Education. What that means, certainly we saw before that a couple weeks ago. We talked a little bit about it with the federal program funding freeze that eventually a circuit court judge blocked. But those things are still at play. And then, of course, the health of the EPA Clean School Bus Program. Haven't been able to talk to anybody over there. There actually was a directive put out by the Trump administration, basically when Trump took office, telling folks at the EPA as well as other federal programs, hey, lock it down. Don't talk to the press. Any programs that were underway, halt them. Tell vendors that you can't talk until later. Certain state stakeholders they can continue having conversations with. But that happens a lot of times when a new administration comes in. They want to take a look at everything, but we know that with the Doge or the DOGE headed up by Elon Musk, that they're looking at everything and taking out their scalpel. So there's a lot of concern there. I know that there are some lobbying being set up with some congressional members, with the EPA itself. So a lot going on, Tony. It's a lot to wrap our heads around as an industry, and certainly from a news standpoint.
Yeah, the Department of Government Efficiency is definitely taking a chainsaw, piece by piece through a lot of groups. And man, the headlines are, there's some insane things that money is being spent on. And I have to think that the Clean School Bus Program sounds pretty sane relative to some of the insane things that they're wasting money on. So hopefully cooler heads prevail and the program stays intact through its entirety. And the intention of it is to get cleaner, greener vehicles into school districts' hands. And the EPA continues to further that mission. And that's the hope, right? I think obviously there's concern because anybody that has any funding is got to be scratching their head thinking, man, are we on the chopping block? Who's next, right? I'm sure.
Oh, certainly. There's headlines I've been reading. In fact, there was a school district in the St. Louis, Missouri area. I found the headline to be a little misleading, to say the least, saying Trump was blocking funding to the school district for the electric school buses. Well, that's not true. But the point there was that when you read the article, the school district had not received their electric school buses yet. Now, the reason why they had ordered Thomas school buses, Thomas Julies, and those orders were delayed because of the hurricane last fall, which impacted a lot of orders. So, but there's concern. And so the school district was talking about how they actually had the charging, but they had no buses yet. So it was opposite of what the challenge has been in a lot of school districts, where they get the school buses, but they don't have enough power. They don't have the infrastructure in or completed yet. But certainly there's a lot of folks that are concerned. Anytime you're talking about purchasing, Tony, you're talking about purchasing, $400,000 buses or, $200,000 diesels, 400,000 electric or 200,000 diesels or anything in between. That's still a lot of money for school districts. And anytime you have uncertainty, the market, just like the larger market here in the U.S., with the economy, there's some trepidation there. Things can kind of grind to a halt. So I think that's the concern. And you see the Clean School Bus Program. I believe it's now at $2.7 billion that's at least been allocated. And I know that with the current rebate that was just awarded recently, I think that's where going forward, there could be some delays in some of those funds getting out. But certainly for the 2.7 billion or so of the 5 billion that's already been allocated and or released and spent, you would think that this ship is too far down the canal to rein back. But I guess never say never. It will be interesting as we move forward and we're actually able to talk with EPA and find out more. There are ongoing webinars and calls being hosted by the likes of WRI and CalSTART. So certainly what's really interesting to me is when I talk to those folks and they don't know what's going on. That's when you know that, these concerns are very relevant and well heeded by the districts.
Yeah, so there's just a lot happening right now. So we'll see how it all plays out on that side, and I think for overall, very optimistic how school transportation is going to look in 2025. I will be very curious to see if the change in immigration policy has an effect on student ridership. So, do we see a decrease in the amount of school children as a result of deportations? Obviously, if parents are being deported out of the country, children potentially can go with them. Does that have some adverse effect? Probably short term, no, but maybe long term, yes. Obviously, we've been seeing a lot of protests and things in Los Angeles around this, and it will be very interesting to see if it doesn't have a bigger effect on students in schools. I know President Trump had been discussing kind of revamping the Department of Education and giving more control to the states and localities. So that again could change the scope of how things work. So time will tell here in 2025, but definitely a lot has happened in the last few weeks since he's taken the presidency, and that will continue to drive headlines around the country. So we'll keep an eye on all that. Ryan has a great interview coming up with Noelle Ellerson Ng, the Associate Executive Director of Advocacy and Governance at AASA, the School Superintendents Association. But before we get to that, we got a quick message. Hey guys, what do software, hardware, and safety have in common? One word: TransFinder. At the STN Expo in Reno, TransFinder won 3 Innovation Choice Awards, voted on by STN Expo attendees for best software, best hardware, best safety technology. TransFinder's Route Finder plus routing solution and apps, Stop Finder and Wayfinder, are well known in the industry. Not everyone realizes TransFinder provides hardware like card readers, tablets, and mounts. And as for safety, Patrol Finder for schools is TransFinder's latest solution designed to make buses and campuses safer. TransFinder's president and CEO, Antonio Civitella, said the recognition means so much because it's voted on by STN Expo attendees. Civitella said, "We know a lot is riding on TransFinder because a lot is riding on those yellow buses that travel through our communities. TransFinder must continue to innovate as more is being expected of transportation departments from district leadership as well as parents." Learn more at transfinder.com. That's transfinder.com.
All right, School Transportation Nation, let's welcome to the podcast stage Noelle Ellerson Ng, the Associate Executive Director of Advocacy and Governance for AASA, the Superintendents Association. Noelle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Ryan, thank you for the invitation to be here. I think it's important for your listeners to also outline or indicate how, through my work at AASA, the national organization representing school superintendents, I head up our lobbying department. And in that role, we also support sister national organizations. We carry advocacy contracts to support them. So direct to this audience, we also support the National Association for Pupil Transportation. So I'm out there repping the good drivers, keeping our kiddos safe on their way to and from school every day.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for that. And NAPT, you mentioned, that was where I really heard or found out about the Supreme Court case that we're going to talk about here in a second. But first, I think I first met you 15, 12 years ago, something like that. And I think you were a policy analyst at the time with AASA. I started going to your national conferences on education, which it's coming up for you guys, March 6th through 8th in New Orleans. All our readers know that we cover every year the Superintendent of the Year award. So certainly stay tuned, readers and listeners, for more on that. I know Taylor Ekbatani is talking to those superintendents, those finalists. So there's articles coming up on stnonline.com. So Noelle, you guys are really busy with that, of course. And, we know how that is with conferences ours coming up, later in March in Charlotte, or their STN Expo East. But there's a lot on your guys' plate right now. I think you mentioned, how many Supreme Court cases are you dealing with now?
We're doing 4 this term.
Oh boy. So, real quickly, what, let's do a rundown on those. Just what are they? We're obviously looking at the Universal Services Fund, which we're really going to dive into here in a bit. But, there's been a lot with, is the Department of Education going to survive under the new Trump administration? I would imagine that's probably what's driving a lot of these legal battles.
No, actually, not quite, because for a case to have reached the point of getting granted cert at the Supreme Court, it has snaked its way through district and circuit courts already. So I think it's important to spend time looking at all three branches because they are equal opportunity offenders or engagers as it relates to federal education policy. And to put it nicely, they are firing on all three cylinders right now. To answer the first question you asked, so for the 4 Supreme Court cases that AASA will be filing an amicus brief on, for those of you who might not be familiar, when Supreme Court arguments happen, each side only gets 30 minutes. And when you want to express your support for or opposition to any of the filings or the arguments being made, an amicus brief is a friend of the court brief. And so AASA will be filing an amicus brief. We usually are joined by other groups who may want to sign on with us, our sister organizations like the principals, the unions, the school boards, it depends, the chief state school officers. For any different policy area, you draw a different set of bedfellows, your partners in crime on a given issue. But the 4 court cases that we will be engaging in on, I don't have their full names memorized, but I can tell you what the topics are. The first one, and the one that's furthest along with our amicus brief, already filed, and then we're just waiting for the date for the hearing. That is the Consumers versus FCC, the case questioning the constitutionality of the funding mechanism underlying the Universal Service Fund. The second case is coming out of Montgomery County. It's a curriculum case and with the right of parents to weigh in or have a say on the type of curriculum offered in a school district. And the third one is about charters. It's coming out of Oklahoma, charters, choice, and privatization. And then the fourth one is related to special ed. This is about ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the interplay between Individuals with Disability Education Act, the premier K-12 special ed law, which turns 50 this year, by the way, and the extent to which families have to exhaust their protections and provisions under IDEA before pursuing damages or support under ADA. And that's just the Supreme Court, Ryan.
Yeah, and there's all the district courts and all the appeals and whatever. So certainly, the final 2 you mentioned there on charter and then on ADA, but the relation to IDEA, those are ones that are right in our ballpark as well. So of course, I'll definitely speak with our legal expert who comes out to our TSD conference in November. I'm sure she knows well about this. So thank you for the heads up on that. But obviously you are super busy. So we want, we could probably talk for 2 hours on just the Universal Services Fund, but I know we were trying to get you to STN Expo East, and you were trying to make it work, and unfortunately, it just didn't work with your schedule. So I wanted to make sure that we got you on the podcast. You've dived into the details on this one. So first of all, let's talk about what USF, or the Universal Services Fund, is.
Sure. I'm going to give a 30,000 foot version that's still going to sound super wonky, but it's important to understand the entirety of the program, not just the lane we usually focus in, the E-rate or Internet for Schools and Libraries, because the case is questioning the constitutionality of the entire program. And so some of the parameters I'm going to put on my explanation here are that this is about the Universal Service Fund in its modern iteration. And by that, we mean everything that's really stemming from the most recent reauthorization of the Telecommunications Act, which was in 1996. I've been at AASA for 17 years, so this predates me. But when you've been doing the same issues for 17 years, you come to know the law and the underlying statutes and the history of the program. So in that 1996 reauthorization, which created the current Universal Service Fund, as it's currently known, the original focus was on phone access. It was about ensuring phone utility access to underserved or underconnected areas. And in the time since 1996, it has been updated. All of the subsequent, there's 4 programs in the Universal Service Fund. It's now a broadband program. It's a very natural evolution. It makes sense that it went from phone access to internet access. And just think about it this way. Ryan, you were a teacher or a secretary in a school in 1996, and the way people got in touch with the school was the phone line. And so we wanted to ensure that students and schools had a point of contact and that the phone line was able to be accessible in every school district in the nation. And now it's 2025, and people get their information online primarily, right? And so it's a natural evolution. So the Universal Service Fund in 1996 was created as a way to generate a pot of funding that's going to provide connectivity now broadband, to 4 historically disadvantaged communities or populations. And those 4 programs are schools and libraries. So now that's internet to schools, that's E-rate. High cost. This is now broadband to high cost areas that, think about it, just geographically isolated, really hard to get your fiber to. These are the areas that AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile aren't going to, because it's hard, and let's be honest, because the profit margins aren't there. These are the areas where you're seeing a lot of rural telcos and smaller telcos step up, and they're heavily relying on the collaboration with and support of the Universal Service Fund to provide that connectivity. That's high cost. Low income. This is sometimes called Obama phone or Lifeline. This is about access at home. And so now it's internet access in low income homes. And these are areas that might be rural, urban, or suburban, but they are under or unserved either because it's cost prohibitive or too expensive. So Lifeline is about internet access at home. And the 4th one is rural health. And this is now broadband connectivity to health providers in rural areas. And so it's about basic internet access. But one of the things that I think is really important is we look at this connectivity. E-rate is for schools, and it's ideally for people who are under connected, but that internet access goes to every child in that building. When that fiber is laid to that high-cost community, yes, it's to a high-cost community that's underserved, but everybody in their community is getting their internet access through that provider, through that network, whether they are high need or low need. When you talk about low-income homes, it's bringing internet into those communities and getting internet access, not just to the people in that house or the person in that house who might be low income, but everyone in that house. And particularly for rural health, it's lighting up or connecting an entire center, not just the patients who are low income that come to that health center. And so one of the things we think about when we look at the potential impact of the upending of this program is how significantly disruptive or catastrophically chaotic it would be to pull those connections. So Universal Service Fund creates those 4 programs. How is it funded? This is a program that is created by law. It is congressionally authorized. It has legislative history, but it has not paid for. Congress has created it in 1996. It is now a $9 billion per year program, and Congress hasn't put a single cent into that. But Noelle, how did they create it, but they're not paying for it? Funny, I should ask myself. What they did was they said, we're going to create a user fee. They're going to assess a fee. The telcos pay a quarterly fee, for lack of a better explanation. It's called a contribution factor. And based on that contribution factor that they're assessed, and they have to make that payment into the Universal Service Fund, which then supports the 4 programs. The telcos were allowed to decide whether they pay their contribution factor out of their bottom line or if they pass it on to consumers. What do you think they did? Mm-hmm. Thank you for paying for Universal Service Fund. We all pay for it. Yes. But that is how the Universal Service Fund is funded. Congress authorized it, but the funds actually come from a contribution factor assessed on the telcos. And that money, about $9 billion per year across all 4 programs, is collected through that mechanism. And that's what we're seeing today. The Universal Service Fund collects those monies pay the $9 billion out.
Okay. So, and when we're looking at this program, because let's talk about now the opposition to it. And you're the expert here, but as I understand it, so when you're collecting those funds, essentially FCC, they set up this Universal Service Administrative Company. Mm-hmm. And from my standpoint, from what I've read, I think that has a lot to do with it. And there's some opposition saying, hey, the FCC went beyond what Congress authorized in setting up this company, essentially. And the argument is that it's the members are folks in the industry, businesses. So let's talk about, what is the opposition? What does this case say? Mm-hmm. So what is the case? Give us a little bit of the history, because it was a Fifth Circuit Court decision that now SCOTUS agreed to look at. And we don't even have it on the docket yet, but we know it's going to happen some point soon over the next soon this spring.
I think this is where it's important to both talk about the history of this case in terms of opposition, but also the historical opposition to the program. And when I think about the historical opposition to the program, it's the general concept of we shouldn't have a federal subsidy, that there's that line of thought. The federal government shouldn't be subsidizing access, or if you can't afford access on your own, you shouldn't need it. There's that element of it. There's also a conversation of the technical structure of it. I think one of the deeply ironic elements of this is that this same question of the constitutionality of the funding mechanism was asked and answered in the Fifth Circuit in the 90s. Court precedent isn't what it used to be. We can point to Dobbs, which upended court precedent, and again here. And in the Fifth Circuit, we see asked and answered the constitutionality of the funding mechanism, and they said that they don't believe it is constitutional. Now, how did this so quickly get up to the Supreme Court? Well, at the exact same time that the Fifth Circuit was hearing it, and the Fifth Circuit is Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, I believe it's the 6th and 8th or the 6th and 10th circuits, also had court cases before them around the constitutionality, and they upheld it. I think we also need to be very honest about how much court shopping is a thing. The Fifth Circuit is one of the more conservative courts in the nation, and it's not an accident that a case questioning the constitutionality of a funding program that supports underserved or historically disadvantaged populations is coming under ire. Like, no, I'm not surprised that it went to the Fifth Circuit and it didn't end up in a more progressive court. It's not an accident. So given the split in decisions between the 3 circuit cases that were out this summer, it is now to the Supreme Court. It's also to the Supreme Court because, to quote the former chairwoman, Jessica Rosenworcel, who is a tireless advocate of all things E-rate and internet access, she was appropriate in saying that it would be catastrophically chaotic to have the implementation of this disrupted. Because if left to stand, that could technically mean that it wouldn't exist in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi. And so, we think about how there's 50 states in the nation, but Texas is such a big state. For the history of the program, Texas alone has received 10% of the universal service funds. So one of the things that I really need to make sense for me, Senator Ted Cruz chairs the Commerce Committee, and I am not always the easiest meeting for his staff, but I do have to give credit where credit is due. He and his staff always have people at the table to have the tough conversations. But the focus Senator Cruz has on dismantling or taking away the active connectivity to a state that is disproportionately, well, not disproportionately, but getting a significant portion of the overall funding for connectivity. When I think about what it would mean for Texas if their rural areas lost their health access, if Texas schools lost their E-rate dollars, if low-income houses lost their internet access, if your geographically isolated rural Texas just lost the connections that they had, it's not as if you can go pick it up down the street or go to the next Target or go to the next Walmart. If you don't have internet access, you don't have internet access. And I think we've become a little bit immune to fully recognizing how much of a utility it almost is. And I think that's part of the conversation, right? There's some part of this conversation, and we're not engaged in it, that thinks internet should be treated like a utility and kind of regulated that way because internet currently isn't. But when you think about how integrated internet is to our daily experience, one of the things I talk about with E-rate, there's a big conversation about how it's about connectivity for schools, and schools use that internet for learning. Absolutely. But do you know how our schools use it before they even start seeing the kids? Specific to your audience, Ryan, how many of your school districts monitor the geographic location of their buses and fleets en route?
Absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm.
How many of our schools use their internet to power their security systems to keep the right people in and the wrong people out? As we look at some of our newer builds, this one cracks me up. Technology is such that sinks and toilets will have their own IP address. So when your internet goes down or your power goes down, you now have an inhabitable building because you don't have sewer access because they're not working. And so internet is not just about teaching and learning in schools. Now it's about basic access and function. And so I've gone off on a tangent. So what the question is specific in this court case is the constitutionality of the funding mechanism. So what happens now is you reference the Universal Services Administrative Court, USAC. Full disclosure, my boss, Dr. David Schuler, sits on the board of USAC. They are the nonpartisan independent group outside of Congress, outside of the FCC, tasked with overseeing implementation of the Universal Service Fund. It was very intentional when they were created. Congress created it, gave authority to the FCC. The FCC looked at the important work that they were going to have to do to implement this program, recognized that the FCC, like any other federal agency, may have technical expertise, but is also subject to political whim because there are appointees and turnover with every administration. So USAC was created as a second entity. And the technical question here is Congress in that role delegated the authority of the program to the FCC, who then delegated it to USAC. And the technical question is that double delegation legal? Is that constitutional? Mm-hmm. And as is always the case with any Supreme Court, it's not just if or how they answer the question, it's how wide or narrow their answer is, right? Because they could say the program is constitutional, it stands. They could say the delegation is fine, but only the single one, which would then mean, okay, that the delegation to the FCC is fine, and they can keep the current structure where it's assessed on the telcos, and then they just have to fold USAC into the FCC. That's an interesting fix. But there's absolutely a constituency out there that thinks the program should go away. Some of them, again, focused on a hyper conservative role that the federal government shouldn't be in your lives. Some driven more by a focus of, if you can't afford it, you shouldn't have the federal government paying it for you. Some people like to say that this is a tax, but it's not a tax. It's not, the telcos are choosing to pass it on to consumers. The federal government did not assess this tax. And then there's a concept of, well, this is a subsidy, this is welfare. And it's just not currently an environment where we can't teach people to care about each other. So kind of that thought there.
Okay. So in terms of, and you had mentioned the political appointees, so I think it's important to talk about in terms of the E-rate side of things. Of course, Learning Without Limits a couple of years ago, you mentioned Jessica Rosenworcel, the former FCC chair. That was essentially a vote of 3-2. It was partisan. There were 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans on the board at the time. Of course, it was the Biden administration. They passed it. The 3 Democrats approved it, voted for it. The 2 Republicans didn't. We obviously have that new environment now, and where the Republicans now have more seats on the board. So I'm interested to know. So if and again, a lot of this is conjecture because we still have to get this court case on the docket. But if the Supreme Court says, okay, we're going to overturn that Fifth Circuit decision, I would imagine the lobbying is going to continue to go to, because I mean, who knows what the next initiative could be, or, rollbacks or whatnot. Is that what AASA's perspective is?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit more to unpack there too, right? Because we wanted the case to get to the Supreme Court, and at the same time, we know the court, it's conservative. We're not confident we're going to get the decision we need. But what we were confident in, and where the FCC was also of the same train of thought under the Biden administration and the leadership of former chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel, was we needed one answer for the land of the program. It needs to be implemented with fidelity and consistency across the 50 states. When you think about the simplicity of the need of internet access. And so we wanted it to go to the Supreme Court, and we're not confident we'll get a decision that protects the program. I mean, we're not confident we're not going to be used to mop the floor. We're somewhere in the middle there. But the other thing that this app does, checks and balances are still a thing. And I was saying that before the last 2 weeks, and maybe checks and balances aren't the thing we thought they were, but naive Noelle's going to believe in the historic precedent of our country. And if the Supreme Court overturns the program, Congress can act, because they created this program and they haven't challenged the constitutionality or taken any effort in any of their work around the Telecommunications Act to substantially address any concerns they have around the funding mechanism. Senator Lujan did have a bill that they were working on that was broader about universal service fund reform, but it tackled multiple issues at the same time, and that didn't really get anywhere. I think that's both a function of the fact that the last Congress was absolutely the least productive since the Great Depression. This Congress may do better, but they also have smaller margins. So like in terms of their majority. So I'm not going to hold my breath. But what I do think is important to be really realistic about is Congress may not be the fastest body in the government to act or to be spurred to action, but I really do think the catastrophically chaotic impact of upending this program would be enough to move a Congress. And yeah, that would be completely reactionary, and they would be dragging us over the finish line, and we would be dragging them over the finish line to protect and preserve internet access. But when you think about how internet and these 4 programs props up inter and intrastate commerce, it would disrupt our economy. And so it's just fascinating to me to think about how we're not seeing a more proactive role from members of Congress on the committees of jurisdiction to think through what language they could include in an appropriations package or in a rider or report language to give some indication or some mark to the court about what it is they're thinking or where their comfort level is in acknowledging that they're okay with how the FCC interpreted the legislative statute that authorized the program. And then, so that's all how we think the Congress would interplay with the Supreme Court decision. At the exact same time, there is another set of threats to some of the changes in E-rate. And you talked about the Learn Without Limits initiative. This stems back to summer of 2022. Chairwoman Rosenworcel, 22 or 23? 23. 23. It was 23. She was announcing Learn Without Limits, which was a 3-pronged proposal that did 2 things to change what E-rate could be used for. It allows E-rate to be used for Wi-Fi on buses and E-rate to be used for internet-enabled devices to go home. The third one was the creation of a 3-year, $2 billion cyber pilot, a pilot program for cybersecurity responses in K-12. Hugely successful demand. We had $3 billion in demand in 1 year alone. And so we had, I think, something like 770 recipients announced across all of the states. Like, we're looking to the pilot. That's a drop in the bucket, right? Like $300 million over 2 years is nothing. We had $3 billion in demand alone. But what it does is a pilot allows us to see who is applying, what the demographics of those districts are applying, how they're describing what their experience is. Are they under active threat? Are they proactive? How are they looking to use the dollars? What are the responses, interventions, and mitigations that they're looking to use these federal dollars for? And then on the back end of this pilot, we can measure what did they use? What did they buy? What did they implement? How did it work? What are we seeing for reports of upticks or downticks in frequency, severity, and duration of these cyber attacks? The other 2 programs are the ones that were actually more partisan. You talked about this 3-2 vote, Democrats sizing with, and Republicans opposing. One of the things that can be done when you move something through regulation, which the Learn Without Limits initiative was, is Congress, depending on the timing of when these final rules are out, can issue something called the Congressional Review Act, which allows them to take back a regulation and say, nope, that was overreach, your administration went too far, et cetera, et cetera. Full disclosure, my organization has used a CRA to our benefit. We saw a full rescission of the accountability regulations on the Every Student Succeeds Act after the first Obama term in 2005. So it was reauthorized in 15, so we must have done that in 16. Like, we've seen CRA's, Congressional Review Act rescissions that we support. This is one that we'll oppose. They are trying to, Senator Ted Cruz has filed the legislation, it's passed out of committee, that would rescind the ability of it's internet access at home. And so it's the Wi-Fi enabled devices going home that he wants to pull back. And so we're sitting here, I say we, because we at AASA are in a coalition for every single issue. We work in lockstep with the principals, the unions, chief state school officers, the parents, the private schools, the independent schools, the libraries, everybody who's a beneficiary is in our E-rate coalition. It's called EdLink, Education Library Network Consortium, EdLink. And I'm not sure we're going to be able to win this one in this Congress, where we have kind of a perfect mix of a president who is absolutely willing to bully pulpit and say, if you don't vote the way I want, I will threaten you with a primary. And primaries are, we all know where it's at for actual risk of losing your election. To the extent that there are Republicans like Ted Cruz who just think it's a gross overreach and that it's an expansion beyond authorized use and original intent of the statute, they think they're doing the right thing by pulling this back and denying access and clawing back authority. Then there are others who think it's just as part of their overall effort to take down the overall Universal Service Fund program, this is taking back something that they thought was already several steps too far. And so that's a full regular legislative effort. We're not too confident we can win that one. We suspect that they will once again do away with internet access to homes, and we'll see continued exacerbation and persistence of the homework gap. As a friendly reminder, what the homework gap means is this is something that's existed for years, but on any given day, upwards of 25% of our nation's students, 12, 13 million, go home and don't have internet access to do their homework. And to the extent that we're looking at chronic absenteeism, engagement, perseverance, and graduation, with how much of our learning and access to content is online, if you don't have internet at home, you're at an educational equity disadvantage.
Okay. And so then that is at play. And again, from the school bus Wi-Fi aspect, we'll wait and see. But there's nothing afoot. It seems like, again, what you're saying is they're focusing more on bringing those devices home and having that access at home.
Yep. Yes, I was double checking that too.
And then I wanted to go back to something you said earlier, because again, it's not on the docket yet. But I think you had mentioned, because this Fifth Circuit decision is what SCOTUS is looking at, and there were 2 other circuits that upheld it. So now, is there a world where you would seem to infer that or suggest that this ruling could just affect those 3 states in the Fifth Circuit, or would it go national?
No, a Supreme Court decision would answer the question for all 50 states. The scenario whereby the Fifth Circuit answer would apply only to those states would be if that's where it stopped, right? And so we've lived that scenario where questions of implementation snake their way up to a circuit, it's answered, But as we look at things, it's either not that disruptive or that much at odds with implementation in other states. And there's not much concern or consternation about the dissonance between what might be minor differences. But in this instance, there was direct conflict. There's also just a politically ripe environment to cut and gut programs that are deemed to be or perceived to be helping those less fortunate. And so for all of those political reasons and the very substantive reasons, like, listen here, this would be catastrophically chaotic. Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi being offline, what would that look like? That might be implemented only in the Fifth Circuit, but how do you do business with Texas if they don't have internet? Now, it's not like the whole state's going to go dark. Areas that have money will figure out how to work around. Telcos will go around and figure out how to get internet access to places. What's going to be impacted is the support that the program offers for equitable access to affordable broadband. That carpet is yanked out, and you'll see a disproportionately negative impact on underserved and historically unserved communities being denied internet access. And when we look at how critical internet access is to day-to-day life or leveling up or being able to engage with society, with your job, with your career, they're being held down.
And a lot of these movements, of course, and you hit on it earlier, they want the federal side of things to come out of it, and I think they want more state control. If that happens, and you just again kind of suggested this, but if it falls on the states, is AASA looking and speaking with the states and finding out what recourse they might have, for funding? And you'd mentioned, working with the telecom providers. But are there existing programs right now at states that could try to make up the difference if USF goes away or E-rate goes away?
There could be. I mean, you got to talk about political willingness and ability. How many states have enough money? Mm-hmm. And if they have enough money, they have the discipline to put it into a program that provides that level of services. How many of those states would you hold your breath that they would create a program that appropriately targets need to designated areas and they can get the telcos to play that way? I'm not sure that I would hold my breath on that.
And just, remind our audience how much, just from the E-rate standpoint, that school bus would be eligible for. What are we talking about in terms of dollars each fiscal year?
Oh, the E-rate program itself is authorized at up to $4 billion. Demand is just under $3 billion. So $3 billion a year just to support school districts. And that might not sound like a lot of funding, but the way you have to think about it is it might not be a huge portion of the overall budget, but you know that school districts operate as stewards of public dollars, and those dollars are finite and they are limited. And so if the support for E-rate goes away, how many school district budgets have enough liquidity and flexibility to cover that shortfall without being at the detriment of something else? So yeah, districts would probably shuffle deck chairs, but maybe they have to eliminate some extracurricular bus supports. Maybe they have to cut a program. I was talking to my sister. She lives in Buffalo. The public schools there provide private transportation for the kids who choose the private schools. And okay, so maybe public dollars have to be looked at using it and prioritizing services for students who actually attend the public schools. Maybe they cut some extracurriculars. Maybe they have to cut some of their higher cost course offerings. Maybe they have to increase student ratios in a classroom, right? Maybe they have to cut the school nurse to halftime. I mean, internet is foundational. And when you think about how it's how we open doors, close doors, run our sinks, power, right? Schools can't operate without internet. So it's not like they're going to say, just joking, we'll go back like it's 1980. So something's going to have to give in the budget.
Okay. In addition to NAPT, several organizations have signed on to the amicus brief. Real quickly, I know there's probably a huge list. I don't want, but can you just kind of give the highlights of some of the major organizations that have signed on?
We were super proud. We got 22 national organizations signing on. So AASA, the School Superintendents, National Association of Pupil Transportation, both unions, both principals groups, actually all three principals groups, elementary, secondary, and federal school administrators. So that's both principals groups and the principals union. We have the independent schools, the Catholic schools, the private schools, the chief state school officers, the Council of Great City Schools, the National Rural Education Association, schools, the Library Association, the National PTA Parent Teachers Association, and that's just to CETA, COSA, ISTE, so Consortium of School Networking, State Ed Directors of Technology Association, CETA, I think that's SETA. It might be SETDA, but it's the State Ed Tech Directors that group is on, and that's just off the top of my head.
Okay. So obviously, yeah, and we know Keith Kruger very well at Coast, and he was out in STN Expo West in Reno a couple of years ago talking about E-rate when it was getting ready to launch. Well, like I said, you have a lot of irons in the fire right now. We'll wait and see, I guess. Unfortunately, I feel like a broken record. So much of what's going on across not just student transportation, but elsewhere. We'll wait and see. So certainly, we'll stay in touch. And when the Supreme Court does hear this, and we know that they would have to have their ruling essentially by June, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I mean, if there's a silver lining here, having it heard later in the term makes it easier for the decision to come later at the term. And in term is June, and June is end of school year. Now, let's talk about timing of impact, right? If the Supreme Court rules the program unconstitutional, it's not as if E-rate dollars are going to be clawed back, right? So process-wise, application window has opened. Application window will probably be completed before this case is heard. So if that application window is heard, opened and shut, and then grants are awarded, the real question is going to be, are you going to hold up those current funds, or are you going to let that play out and apply the ruling to a subsequent year? So yes, we're going to be very, very concerned about the decision, but I'm not right now alarmist about it uprooting internet access during the testing cycle at the year end for this school year.
But it's something certainly, and I know I mentioned to you before we went on air that I've heard from a couple school districts already that have relied on during this current first fiscal year for funding and received funding. They're having meetings, obviously, with their administrations, their superintendents and whatnot on, okay, what happens next? So you're saying it's probably okay, at least for another fiscal year, if Supreme Court does uphold it. But then we'll have some more decisions certainly to have to come to.
I'm confident we're okay with the current school year. I'm less certain for what it means for, like, if the decision is in June, is it immediately in effect? So if you drew down funds for the 25-26 school year and it goes in, the ruling is in June, they might say for the next school year. I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah.
But if a ruling comes in May or June and there's still school year, I don't see those. We have a little bit of time there. First
things first, of course, yes, the Supreme Court has to put it on the docket. So we'll be waiting to see when that happens. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, Noelle, thanks again for coming on and sharing more, enlightening us about the history of this debate of the program and the potential impacts. So thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your week, I guess. I know that you've got a lot to do, and you have your conference.
No, I will. And good luck with yours. My husband's family is in North Carolina. I was really trying to get there. So thank you for the invite. Thank you for this consolation conversation. It was very generous of you. I'm always happy to talk E-rate with you and your crew. Thank you. And I look forward to seeing you in New Orleans.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Noelle.
Bye.
A special thanks to Noelle and Ryan for joining this episode. Great conversation. We appreciate our sponsors, TransFinder and School Radio. Make sure you visit stnonline.com for our latest news and analysis on the school transportation industry. And don't forget to register for STN Expo East out in Charlotte, North Carolina. That is coming up really fast. Our early bird registration ends on Valentine's Day. That's 2/14. Don't forget, you can save $100. stnexpo.com/east to lock that in. Check out our agenda of classes, networking events, maybe drive a bus on the Charlotte Motor Speedway. You never know. Got lots of fun things going on. Our Bus Technology Summit, our Transportation Director Summit, Green Bus Summit. There is a lot of content there, a lot of networking happening. We'll have hundreds of people there all coming together in the school transportation industry, guys. Make sure you don't miss it. Again, Charlotte, March 20th through the 25th. Guys, remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to pods. We got weekly episodes for you, Nation. If you want to go check out the archive, we got lots of those too. Lots of great episodes. Make sure you go on, subscribe, hit that subscribe button. Nation, we love you. We'll see you next week.